So as we'll see this morning, the eighth commandment is deeply intertwined with the 10th commandment. And so while we have spent usually a 1- and 2-part sermon on each of the commandments thus far, we're going to do a 3-part on this one because we're going to essentially cover a large portion of the 10th commandment along the way. And I think you're going to see how the 10th and particularly the 8th, and while the 10th does connect to many of the other commandments as well, you'll see how it especially connects with the 8th commandment this morning. And so we will have a part 3 on this when I return. And if you haven't listened to part 1, I do encourage you to do that. I will summarize it here briefly this morning. But I kind of want you to see how all of these things fit together. And as Albert said, how they are embedded in the fabric of creation and how things work. And so this week we're picking up where we left off, looking at the 8th commandment, you shall not steal. In our last time we considered specifically the nature of the 8th commandment, the nature of the 8th commandment. In doing so, we began by answering the question, why is theft sin? Or why is stealing wrong? And to answer that question, we considered first that God owns everything. God owns everything. That to the Lord your God belong heaven and the earth, and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. Deuteronomy 10:14. For the Lord declares that every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills, that I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. So number one, the Lord owns everything. Second, we considered how God has made man a steward of his creation. God has made man a steward of his creation, if you will, a manager of his assets. He owns everything, and we have been made managers of his assets. That we are to have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. That God has given man dominion over the works of his hands. That he has put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. And thirdly, that God has allotted each of us a portion of those assets. God has allotted each of us a portion of those assets, just as Jesus illustrated in his parable of the talents that we looked at in our last time in Matthew 25, where Jesus likened the kingdom of heaven to a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. Entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. The parable is meant to teach his disciples that they've been given a responsibility to steward and use the resources given them to serve their master, to put their allotted resources to work and to provide their master with a return on his investment. That's his expectation for us. However, the parable also teaches us that God has allotted each of us a different portion. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. That God gives to each of us a different portion as he sees fit. Therefore, stealing is wrong or is not wrong merely because it hurts other people. Stealing isn't wrong merely because it hurts other people. It certainly does, as we'll see in a minute. But its fundamental reason for being wrong is because it is a sin against God. God owns everything. That he has made man a steward of his assets, property manager, if you will. He has given us portions of those assets to steward. And for us to meddle with that, for us to say that you shouldn't have given him or her that much and therefore I'm going to take it, is a sin against God. That stealing violates God's authority and prerogative to give you whatever portion he sees fit, which differs from your neighbor. That stealing not only harms your neighbor, but it insists that you know better than God. Stealing insists that you know better than God, that you believe you would be a better manager of his assets than him. That he's given your neighbor too much or not given you enough. And so it's important for us to recognize this, because otherwise we'll find all kinds of reasons or all kinds of justifications to steal from our neighbor. It's not enough to say that stealing is wrong simply because it hurts people. Rather, stealing is wrong first and foremost because it is a sin against God. So because God owns everything and possesses the authority and prerogative to allocate his assets as he sees fit, it is therefore forbidden for us to deprive our neighbor of his property. And that's the essence of the 8th commandment. We do not possess the right to redistribute the assets that God has already distributed. We do not possess the right or the authority to redistribute the assets that God has already distributed, not under any circumstance. Neither the government nor the individual possesses this authority. So in light of the nature of this commandment, I want to consider today the scope and application of the 8th commandment. And as we've seen before, the scope of the 10 commandments are considerably and consistently much broader and deeper than most of us realize, which is why most of us are inclined to think that of all the commandments, we've probably kept the 8th commandment pretty well. In fact, you might be inclined to think that you've never stole anything at all. But the truth is, the 8th commandment includes far more than just petty theft. So let me start by highlighting some of the implications of the 8th commandment, just to kind of give us a flavor for its expansiveness, its broad scope, with just a few examples. And these aren't necessarily in any particular order or exhaustive, but I think it should help you see just how far-reaching this commandment is and how it's intended to govern your life and how much of your life it governs. For example, because the 8th commandment forbids theft, it also forbids man-stealing. We see this actually in the Old Testament specifically mentioned, such as enslavers or other forms of human trafficking. Sex trafficking would be an example. It forbids cheating. If you've ever cheated in a board game or on a test or when you're competing, cheating is a violation of the 8th commandment. Swindling, when you use deception to take someone's money, like knowingly selling someone a lemon without them knowing. This is a violation of the 8th commandment. Scams, fraud, such as insurance fraud or stealing someone's identity. I know many people are accustomed to taking advantage of insurance companies by insurance fraud. Counterfeit money. Excessive interest, for example, predatory loans that seek to take advantage of other people. Taking advantage of the poor. Borrowing without asking. Borrowing without returning. Neglecting to pay back your debts, like defaulting on a loan or filing for bankruptcy. Late paying back your debts, for example, not paying back your bills on time, is a violation of the 8th commandment. That's someone's resources that they're expecting to get on a particular time so they can continue to do business and to take care of their own family. And so when we do not pay back our bills on time, we are stealing. More examples, piracy, such as software, movies, music, etc. I remember growing in my teenage years, Napster was a big thing. I don't know how many of you remember Napster, but Napster was a software, and you could basically go and download about any song you could think of. It was this peer-to-peer network, and you could get on your computer and pick all the songs you wanted, and you just hit download. And I remember we used to have competitions between friends as to who had the fastest internet connection, could download the most songs, and who had the biggest library. We were stealing other people's property. Other examples include using someone else's media subscription, taking advantage of errors such as keeping duplicate shipments of products, and that could be an easy thing out here in Alaska. We know how to game the system if we're not careful. We know that a package gets lost by their standards because it's not here yet and it's been a month. Well, we know that package probably eventually will show up, but because of Amazon's policy or Walmart's policy or whoever else, we know we can go ahead and claim it as lost and get another one shipped our way, and we'll end up with two. That's called theft. Failing to disclose damage when selling an item. Overusing free samples. How many of you have been to Costco and probably had more samples than you ought to have taken? Sneaking into a movie theater or gymnasium or workout, a place to work out. Cutting in line is a violation of the 8th commandment, stealing a person's position in line. Taking credit for someone else's work. Plagiarism, taking credit for someone else's ideas. Unequal weights and measures, putting your thumb on the scales. Neglecting to pay your employees on time or at all. Underpaying your employees, neglecting to give them a fair wage. Extortion such as ransomware in my scope of the industry in IT, which holds your data hostage until you pay them money. They won't give you access to your files again. False lawsuits, bribery, emotional manipulation. Gambling, for example. Casinos are purposely built for material gain without paying a price, and they prey on the poor, and promoting the desire to get wealth without work. Stealing time, such as wasting or stealing the time of others, whether that's your employer's time, not showing up for your appointments, or stealing the time of others by always being perpetually late. Slacking off. Tax evasion, how easy is it to claim things that you ought not to claim in order to have a greater tax benefit? Stealing money by lying on your taxes, using company resources for personal gain without permission, claiming lost property without reporting it, and so on, right? This list is huge. And I've just listed a few. And we usually may have a multitude of excuses for breaking the 8th commandment, don't we? We say things like, they already have enough. They can afford it. They'll never miss it. Everyone does it. I was desperate. It's not illegal. They deserve it. They'll replace it. They're overcharging anyway. How many of you have said or thought these things or used them as a justification for violating the 8th commandment? I suspect many of us have. If you have, it's a sure sign you've broken the 8th commandment. If stealing was wrong merely because it hurts people, then many of these excuses might be valid reasons. If that were the heart of the 8th commandment, then some of those excuses might work. You're right, they didn't need it. You're right, they didn't need it. But the nature of the 8th commandment goes much deeper than that. If it's first a sin against God, then it doesn't matter whether they needed it or not by your reckoning. It's whether that God gave it to them or not. Stealing is first and fundamentally a sin against God. And so none of these excuses hold any water. Another sin we ordinarily don't think about in the context of stealing is laziness. Laziness. Laziness is a violation of the 8th commandment because it says someone else will do it. Someone else will do it. Laziness is a manifestation of selfishness, and it usually results in stealing from others. Laziness often takes advantage of charity, for instance. For example, government programs, free room and board from a friend or a family member, and so on. And more fundamentally, laziness steals from itself. Laziness steals from itself. Stealing from what God has entrusted to it or to you and spending it exclusively on yourself. God has given you these resources for more than just you. He has given them for a much broader and greater purposes. He's given them for your spouse, to support your spouse, husbands. He's given it to you for your children. He's given it to you to spend on your neighbor as well. Not only to spend on yourself, but also other things. And so stealing from what God has entrusted to you and spending it exclusively on yourself. This is laziness. This is often referred to as squandering your wealth or stealing from yourself, which parallels suicide in the 6th commandment, or self-murder that's forbidden by the 6th commandment. And so laziness is also forbidden in the 8th commandment. If you recall in Jesus' parable of the talents, the servant who was given 1 talent did what? He buried it, right? And when the master returned, what did he say to that wicked servant? He said, "You wicked servant, wicked and what servant? Slothful, lazy servant." Interesting, huh? The servant was rebuked for being lazy. One of my daughters made this connection just 2 weeks ago in our part 1 of this series. She had been looking for a job recently, had been somewhat reluctant for various reasons, but realized that as she put it in her message to me, God has given me the ability and strength to work and to get a job. Therefore, if I choose to be lazy and not to do it, that I am not fulfilling the 8th commandment. A very astute observation. To be lazy, to neglect, to put to work what God has given you, the resources of which He has entrusted to you, is a violation of the 8th commandment. Therefore, to fulfill the 8th commandment is to put those abilities and those resources to work so that you might have a return for your master. And she was right. Furthermore, this also means that subsidizing laziness is also an 8th commandment violation. When we subsidize or support laziness, we become complicit with it. In essence, we subsidize theft, which includes subsidizing the laziness of your children, your friends, or in the society at large. The Apostle Paul famously wrote in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, "If anyone is not willing to work," what? "Let him not eat." Doesn't sound very loving, does it? By the world's standards. But you remember, the 8th commandment is the 10 commandments that define how we love our neighbor. We often feel this conflict when we see someone in the street asking for money. On one hand, we want to help the poor and we don't want people to go hungry, so we're inclined to help, as we should be. As we should be. That is a good knee-jerk reaction. It's a very Christianly response. However, on the other hand, we also eventually come to realize that many of these people are actually seeking to exploit you. They're seeking to exploit us and intend to squander anything that we give them on alcohol or other drugs or something else that they do not need. They're trying to take advantage of you. Therefore, we have to be very discerning when helping the poor, or anyone for that matter, in order to avoid subsidizing laziness because we care about the 8th commandment. This is also why government social programs are so particularly dangerous. They may mean well, but they're dangerous because many of them can be easily exploited to subsidize a person's laziness. This is also important for parents to understand. Because we're inclined to help our adult children, for instance. We're obligated, we have a responsibility to subsidize them when they're young, but not for into perpetuity, but with the intention that they would also be taking the talents given to them, the resources given to them, and multiplying them in their lives, not subsidizing them through the end of our own. And so, as parents, we can be inclined to help our adult children when they're in need, even if their need is the result of their own laziness and neglect. That's a temptation parents can and often face. We have to recognize that we're not doing our adult children any favors by subsidizing their laziness, and that we make ourselves complicit in it when we do. We might be tempted to think that loving our adult children demands that we support them, even when it means subsidizing their laziness, but nothing would be further from the truth. As I pointed out at the beginning of our series on the 10 Commandments, biblical love is never at the expense of truth or the law of God. And as Christians, we've got to recognize that. We've got to understand that and hold on to that. Biblical love is never at the expense of truth or the law of God. Instead, the law of God defines love for us. The law of God defines love for us. It defines how we love God in the first 4 commandments, that first table of the law, and how we love our neighbors, commandments 6 through 10. Which means loving your neighbor will often result in making hard and unpopular decisions, or what some of us have called tough love. And it won't necessarily look like love to the world. But we're not here to appease the world and its demands. And it won't look like love to the world because the world loves sin. And the law stands in opposition to the sin. And so the world's not going to like how you carry out biblical love. Because biblical love has no toleration for sin. You see, the world will attempt to exploit your obligation to love your neighbor. Therefore, if you don't understand how love is defined by Scripture, then you'll fall prey to the world's efforts to take advantage of you. If you don't recognize that laziness is fundamentally theft, then the world will inevitably convince you that you're obligated to subsidize their laziness in order to show love to your neighbor. They'll pull on your heartstrings. They'll pull on your heartstrings. We must realize that theft is frequently committed in the name of loving our neighbor. And we have to be aware of that. Therefore, it's critical as we survey these 10 commandments that we recognize how they define love for us, and that they're a guide on how to love your neighbor. Whether that's a family member, someone at church, at work, or your neighbors elsewhere. This doesn't mean we're not merciful. This doesn't mean we don't show kindness. But it does mean that our love is defined by the law of God and not man's sensibilities or love for sin. Now, not only is the scope of the 8th commandment much broader than we usually realize, and I hope you can see that just with the list and looking at laziness, but like the other commandments, it also reaches to the heart. It also reaches to the heart. It's not merely just a horizontal scope of look of all the actions that the 8th commandment touches, but also how deep it extends, that it reaches even the heart, to the very motivations behind stealing. The 8th commandment not only forbids the act of stealing, but also its motivations. So the 8th commandment doesn't just forbid all of those particular actions, but it forbids the motivations from which those actions sprung. The 8th commandment is intended to reach and govern the affections of your heart. And this is where the 8th commandment runs into contact, especially with the 10th commandment. Any of you remember the 10th commandment? You shall not what? Covet. And while our motivations can sometimes be complex and difficult to discern, at the heart of violating the 8th commandment is greed. At the heart of the 8th commandment is greed. You see, as Reverend Adriel Sanchez put it, he said, greed views the quest for temporal goods as ultimate. Greed views the quest for temporal goods as ultimate. Like this is the only end goal in life, is acquiring goods. That's the heart of greed. And it's the heart of any violation of the 8th commandment. Greed believes that temporal goods or riches will make you happy. That it will make you happy. And as a result, temporal goods and riches become an idol. They become an idol. Because we view them as ultimate, they become idolatrous. And rather than worshiping God, we worship these possessions, these riches, and we seek to accumulate more of them. Most of us are familiar with Jesus' interaction with the rich young ruler that Albert read this morning. But we often don't understand Jesus' point when he tells the man to sell all that he has and to give it to the poor. Listen to their interaction recorded in Mark 10:17. Listen to it again. And as he was setting out on his journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not defraud. Honor your father and mother." And he said to him, "Teacher, all of these I have kept from my youth." And Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said to him, "You lack one thing. Go, sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me." Mark goes on. He says, disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful. Why? For he had great possessions. Many Christians have wrestled with whether or not Jesus' command to the rich young ruler to sell all of his possessions was a universal requirement for all of his disciples to follow. In fact, I had a conversation with a brother not long ago, maybe a year, who asked if he should sell all of his possessions as a result of this text. He was very sincere. You could tell he was in part grieved. Like, this is a big deal. Like, this is serious. But I assured him this wasn't what Jesus was instructing his disciples to do. Instead, listen to this. Jesus' point was that while this man thought he had kept all of the commandments, the truth was he hadn't. And so Jesus cleverly revealed this by telling him to sell all of his possessions to the poor and to follow him. But then Mark tells us that the man went away sorrowful. Why? Because he had great possessions. In other words, this man's quest for temporal goods was so great that made him unwilling to sell them and follow Jesus. Do you see that? In other words, this man's quest for temporal goods was so great that it made him unwilling to sell them and follow Jesus. His possessions had become idolatrous. They had become an idol fueled by greed and then a stumbling block as a result to following Jesus. And possessions and riches can be just that in our lives if we're not careful. Because greed makes possessions and riches the thing to be worshipped. And so when Jesus walks by and says, "Come follow me," we can't. Because we already worship something. Greed views temporal possessions and riches as a source of happiness. In other words, and listen to this word, I'm going to use it very purposefully. Greed treasures temporal possessions and riches. It treats them as if they were treasure, to be treasured. This is an important word because it's used in the New Testament by Jesus at various points. And how often have you heard or used the phrase, "This is a treasured possession of mine"? These are my treasured possessions. Well, what do I mean when I say that? These possessions over here are unlike my other possessions. I treasure these. Matthew 6:19, in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, this is what Jesus taught his disciples. He said, "Do not lay up for yourselves" what? On earth. Treasures. There's that word. "Where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But instead, lay up for yourselves treasures" where? In heaven. Lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your what will be also? Your heart. You see, your heart's attached to whatever your treasure is. That's important for us to recognize. And so if your possessions and your riches are your treasure, where's your heart going to be? There. Jesus isn't teaching his disciples that they shouldn't work hard, earn a living, provide for their families, and seek to make a return on their master's investment. No, Jesus is teaching them that they shouldn't make their temporal possessions and riches their treasure. Get a bunch of them. Use them to the glory of God, but don't make them your treasure. Because on earth is where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. People can get that treasure. That treasure can be taken. Why would you want it anyway? But that their treasure should instead be in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal, because there, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You see, if heaven and Christ are your treasure, no one can take that from you. They can take everything, every earthly possession from you. Every earthly riches that they can take from you. We're watching LA right now burn to the ground, Hollywood. People who have more treasures than anybody else on earth. And they're losing them. Watched an interview with a gentleman named J.J. Redick, who's a basketball coach of the Los Angeles Lakers. And he just was, you could just tell, like, wow, we couldn't do anything about this. We couldn't get back to our house in time. It just... poof, gone. Everything we owned. Everything that we knew with our children, pictures, things we had done, all of that, just gone. But see, if your treasure is in heaven, that can't happen. No one can take it from you. So the rich young ruler's treasure was his temporal possessions and riches. Therefore, his heart was there also. We also see greed at work in Luke 12, 13 through 15, when Jesus is approached by someone in the crowd. So Albert read this one this morning as well, who asks Jesus to settle a dispute over an inheritance. Like, dang, man, do you not hear yourself? Like, I read that, and I'm like, that, once those sort, you have those things that come out of your mouth, and you're like, oh no, why am I asking that? That reveals a lot about my heart that I don't want to. Well, in Luke 12, 13 through 15, when Jesus is approached by someone in the crowd who asks him to settle a dispute over inheritance, this is what we read. This is how blind we can be to their own motivations of our heart and how wicked they are, right? He says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." Listen again to that last phrase. It's so important. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of what? Possessions. Goods, riches, they're not ultimate. One's life does not consist in having them. This phrase describes greed so well because greed believes that life consists merely in the abundance of possessions. Greed treasures temporal possessions and riches above all else, even Christ. This is why Jesus would say that it's like a camel going through the eye of a needle to describe the rich man entering the kingdom of heaven. Why? Because he can't bring all his goods with him. While we're intended to be stewards of the talents entrusted to us and to make a return on them for our master, those talents must never become our treasure. Those talents must never become our treasure. Rather, we're commanded to store up treasure in heaven, which is also why Jesus taught his disciples when he gave them parables. In Matthew 13, some of his first parables, in his shortest parables, listen to this, Matthew 13:44, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has." All his earthly treasures, he sells them all to have that treasure in order to buy that field. Or one verse later, Matthew 13:45, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it." You see that? The kingdom of heaven, Christ, it's worth selling all of your earthly treasures for. In other words, the kingdom of heaven is worth selling all of your temporal possessions and riches in order to possess it. You see, to the Christian, Christ is our treasure, not our careers, not our house, not our boat, not our children, not any of our temporal possessions or riches, but Christ alone. This is the Christian life. Christ is supreme. Christ is our treasure. Now, greed also breeds a consumerist mindset. These are some of the ways that you can kind of gauge how is greed working in my heart. So I want to kind of have the law kind of flesh some of those out, expose those things by shining a light on it. That's what the law does. It's like a mirror. And you look in the mirror and you're like, oh man, I am dirty. But the law can't clean you up. So we have to recognize that. The law can't clean you up, nor can you keep it. But it does act as a really good mirror. It shines a really good light on the sin in our life, but it does not forgive sin. But greed also breeds a consumerist mindset where a person seeks to spend all of their riches solely on their own pleasures, living primarily to consume whatever they can for themselves. Now, while we're certainly stewards of God's assets and intended to make a return on our master's investment, this does not mean that God intends for us to spend all that he gives us solely on our own pleasures. James points this out in his letter. In James 4, chapter 4, verse 1, he says, "What causes quarrels and fights among you?" I've used this text with my children quite a bit. What causes quarrels and fights among you? When there's a quarrel and a fight in the home, I'm like, okay, look, let's read James chapter 4, verse 1. What's causing these quarrels? Because James is going to tell us. Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and you do not have. So what do? You murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask, and you ask and you do not receive. Why? Because you ask wrongly. And here's the kicker. How do you ask wrongly? To spend it on your passions. You want to get stuff to feed you and spend it on you, and you'll do anything to get it and squash anybody to get it. This is what causes quarrels and fights among you. Greed. It's not that it's inherently sinful to desire the things that we need. It's not what I'm saying. Or even to want something that we don't need. God allows us to get things that we don't need. We glorify God. We can glorify God in doing that. You can have things beyond your bare minimum needs. But that's different than intending to spend everything on yourself. And so it's not sinful to desire what we need or even what some of the things that we want that we don't need. But it's wrong when our motivations are rooted in greed or covetousness. The desire becomes sinful when we believe possessions will make us happy, when we think that we won't be happy unless we have what we want. If that's you, that's greed. That's you, that's greed. If you feel that, that's greed. The desire becomes sinful when it turns our temporal possessions into an idol. We're not meant to approach wealth with a consumer-like mindset. Wealth isn't intended to be merely spent or squandered on your own pleasures. The goal isn't to accumulate as much wealth as you can to spend it on yourselves, but this has become particularly prevalent in our culture. And we could list many examples, but I'll list just a few to kind of highlight how we can identify consumer-like mindsets in our lives. For example, a consumeristic view of children often results in parents having very few, if no children at all. Often gets talked about in the news how our population is beginning to what? Decline. It's already been declining for years in Europe. This is one of the reasons why. That parents have very few or no children at all, because as consumers, we view our children as competing for our wealth that we would otherwise prefer to spend on who? Ourselves. There have been many times when I found myself angry with my wife for spending money on new winter boots for our 4 children. That's a big hit, especially if they're nice winter boots. Not because we didn't have necessarily enough money. There were times like that. But many times it had nothing to do with whether we had enough money or not, or because they didn't need them, but because I wanted that money to spend on myself. You see, children compete. And if there's greed in your heart, they're going to expose it real quick, because they're going to take some of that money you want to have to spend on yourself. And so what do? We have less children, so I can spend more on me. And I'm sure at times I cloaked, whether knowingly or unknowingly, my desires with virtue. I argued, for instance, that we needed to be more frugal. And it's absolutely 8th commandment keeping to be frugal. We're going to talk about that in our next time. But I'm going to use that as an argument to say why we shouldn't get more boots for my kids. Oh, they can shove their feet in the old ones. They'll be fine. I got something else I want to spend that money on. That's what was really happening. And so over time, I came to realize that I was often angry because my children's needs were competing for my resources. I also remember earlier on in our marriage when our children were very small, and I would get angry or even pout to make my wife feel bad when I realized the responsibility of my children was getting in the way of some far-off hike. And any of you know me, I love to go hiking, and I don't do much anymore. I'm getting older, or any other activity. And all of a sudden, I have these kids. And now if I'm going to hike, I'm going to have to bring them all. And if I'm going to bring them, they're going to scream and cry, and it's going to be hard, and we're not going to go very far. I'm not going to get to the top of that peak. This is what's going on in my head. I just want to spend all my time, my resources on me, and these kids are getting in the way. That's greed. I was selfish, and I wanted to spend my resources, including my time, on myself. We'd laugh and chuckle, and hopefully those are good examples that you can relate to. But that's greed, ladies and gentlemen, that lives in our hearts. And it has a consumeristic outlook on life that I'm just here to consume. And that will be the demise of our country. Because we're just going to keep consuming, and we can't last doing that. We have to be producers, not merely consumers. This attitude is also at odds with generosity. This attitude is at odds with generosity. Greed is fundamentally opposed to generosity. While generosity seeks to spend its wealth and its resources on others, greed seeks to spend its wealth and resources only on itself. I feel this tension every time I give. Every single time. Whether it's to the local church or someone in genuine need, generosity doesn't come naturally to sinful man. And if you think that it needs to come naturally before you're going to do it, well, then you probably never will. You probably never will, because generosity is an exercise of faith that our flesh stubbornly opposes every single time. But it's important for us to remember that generosity is intended to be an exercise of our faith, and that it actively lays up for us treasure in heaven rather than on earth. And as a result, it orients our hearts away from our earthly pleasures or possessions and riches, and orients it toward Christ and His kingdom. That's what generosity, what giving does. Which is why undoubtedly Jesus taught that it is more blessed to give than to receive. That's so contrary to the flesh. What do you mean it's more? What do you mean it's more blessed to give than to receive? I don't get more stuff if I give it away. You see, it's contrary to the way the flesh thinks. Furthermore, you can be full of greed whether you're a spender or a saver. You can be full of greed whether you're a spender or a saver. Sometimes we think that people who are living paycheck to paycheck and can't control their spending are the only ones who struggle with greed. But this isn't the case at all. When Jesus told the man from the crowd that his life didn't consist in the abundance of his possessions, he went on to tell them in the parable that this man, he went on to tell them a parable, and let's go ahead and just read this parable again. He told them the parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. He wasn't going to necessarily spend it all at once, all in one day. He wasn't going to burn a hole in his pocket, so to say. He was looking for a place to store it. And he said, well, I will do this. I will tear down my barns that I've already stuffed full, and I'm going to go build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? You're not going to take them with you? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Notice how this man is, how he's described. He's described as someone who hoards his wealth. Hoards his wealth. You might be a really good saver. You might be hoarding your wealth. You should save your money. You should be wise with your money. You should be frugal. All of those things. But just because it looks like that on the outside doesn't mean greed isn't at work. Because hoarding your wealth is a symptom of greed. He was obviously very capable of multiplying his wealth, but he was also very good at holding on to it. So don't assume that just because you're good at saving your money that you've overcome greed. And furthermore, we should recognize that hoarding our possessions is usually a sign of greed. In fact, this has become such a phenomenon in our day that we have shows like Hoarders. You realize what we're celebrating when we watch that and get excited about hoarders? Like, wow, look at these people. Greed. I mean, they're poor and destitute usually in so many ways, but they can't get rid of their stuff. Why? Because of greed. And now it's our entertainment. Shame on us. Now, the words greed and covet are both translated using the same Greek word, pleonexia in the New Testament, which means the state of desiring to have more than one's due. The state of desiring to have more than one's due, or a strong desire to acquire more and more material possessions, or to possess more things than other people have, all irrespective of need. Need goes out the window, I just want more. Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian from the 13th century, defined covetousness or greed as the immoderate love of possessing. The immoderate love of possessing. In other words, greed is not content with what it has or with God's provision, but is constantly discontent. It's constantly dissatisfied. If you struggle with greed, you'll notice that you never can satisfy it by how much stuff and things you buy. It's always this whole, you got to stuff more in. This is because temporal possessions and riches do not have the capacity to satisfy you. They were never designed to do that. They do not have the capacity to satisfy the human heart. Therefore, greed cannot be satisfied and will never be content with a particular quantity of riches or material possessions. I remember looking at a Yahoo article. This is probably 20 years ago now. I was in college, I think, and this article was surveying millionaires, and it had something to do with how much is enough. And they said, well, and the overwhelming answer was a little more. Why would they say that? You're a millionaire, and you still would just want a little more? Why? Greed. Because it's never enough. It's never enough. And as a result, greed eventually aims its desires at its neighbor. That's where we're going with this. It eventually aims its desires at its neighbor. It seeks to steal. It seeks to become a thief in order to gain more. Because it's never enough. Which is why the 10th commandment in Exodus 20:17 forbids coveting. It's why greed and coveting in the English, in the New Testament, is translated as the same Greek word. The same. They're synonymous. It says in Exodus 20, verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet his male servant or his female servant or his ox or his donkey or anything that is your neighbor's. As one writer put it, greed is stealing with the eyes of your heart. Greed is stealing with the eyes of your heart. Obviously, it's impossible to consider this 8th commandment without considering the 10th, as we've spent looking at today. And so we're going to have to wrap up this morning with the 8th commandment, and at a latter time, probably 3 weeks from now, we're going to finish up our look at the 8th commandment. And we're going to consider the positive side of the 8th commandment. What it looks like to uphold the 8th commandment. Because if you remember, every commandment has a negative and a positive side to it. Don't do this, therefore you must do this. Don't murder, uphold life. Don't steal, preserve your neighbor's property. You see that? And so we're going to look at that in our next time. But until then, let's go ahead and pray. Heavenly Father, I pray that as we consider the scope of the 8th commandment, that we aren't driven to despair, but are driven to Christ. Lord, these commandments can be overwhelming when we consider them deeply. That, wow, how dirty I am in the mirror. But Lord, let that drive us to Christ. Let the law expose our sin that we might be driven to Christ, that we might be made clean, that we might be washed. Recognizing that the law is a mirror, that it exposes our sin, but that it does not and cannot forgive our sin. Only Christ can. Lord, I pray that the law would shed light on our sin, and the Spirit would use it as a tool to conform us into the image of Christ. Help us to put to death greed in our lives, to be content with our lot, to work diligently, and to make a return for our Master, not making our earthly possessions and riches our treasure, but instead storing up treasures in heaven. In Jesus' name, amen.